Thanks for checking out my video, Defining Heavy Metal. This is part 3, so make sure you check out the other videos in the series. Progressive metal's roots are, unsurprisingly, in 70s and 80s progressive rock. Rush, Pink Floyd, Styx, and Yes were all huge influences on this genre. Combining the loud aggression and heavily distorted guitars of metal and combining it with the highly technical aspects of progressive rock gave birth to the initial wave of progressive metal bands such as Fate's Warning, Queensryche, Dream Theater, Tool, and Symphony X. The use of complex rhythms and arrangements, odd time signatures, multiple harmonies, and an emphasis on technical proficiency are what define this genre. Full concept albums are quite common among progressive metal bands. Following the initial wave, other bands began incorporating progressive elements into even more aggressive musical styles, creating a second wave of progressive metal bands that blur the lines between genres. Opeth, Nevermore, Gojira, Trivium, Mastodon, and Mudvayne. Depending on who you talk to, there's debate on if glam metal should even be considered metal at all. Since it's such a widely used term to describe a number of extremely popular bands, I'm going to include it here. Glam metal, also often referred to as hair metal or even arena rock, takes its inspiration from the stage theatrics of bands like Kiss, the New York Dolls, and other glam rock acts of the 70s. Some people would nitpick that there's a distinct difference between glam metal and hair metal, but in all honesty, the only real difference is that one uses more makeup than the other. Glam, of course, gets its name from glamorous, and the defining traits are mainly aesthetic, with bands adopting a very vibrant look on stage with big hair, full makeup, and brightly colored spandex. Now, by the end of the 80s, most of the glam bands had managed to tone down their image a bit, so I guess this could be where you'd call them hair metal. Musically, the songs are generally upbeat with catchy guitar riffs and blistering solos. The production lends itself to a softer, more mainstream sound as opposed to the harsher sound of traditional heavy metal. Lyrics are often centered around love or partying, embodying the sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle of the 1980s. The power ballad was a very common staple among glam metal bands and would often end up being their most popular song. Warrant, Motley Crue, Poison, and Cinderella music videos were a common sight on MTV in the 80s. Other bands such as Def Leppard, Quiet Riot, Whitesnake, Slaughter, and Queensryche would also fall into this category, albeit with a slightly less flamboyant visual approach. Skid Row, Guns N' Roses, and early 80s Pantera had a slightly more aggressive approach musically, but would still fit in here. On the opposite end of the spectrum from glam metal lies death metal, an extreme form of metal that developed during the 80s. Taking many cues from thrash metal, it features heavy distortion, low-tuned guitars, and fast tempos, often with heavy use of double kick drums or blast beats. The vocal style has also been taken to the extreme, once again in the opposite direction. Where many traditional metal bands will use high-pitched vocals, death metal instead uses what has been termed the death growl. I guess the best way to describe this is picture Cookie Monster swallowing a box of razors and then fronting a metal band. Lyrical themes can often include death and dismemberment with copious amounts of blood and gore. Now, it's important to note that the vast majority of death metal musicians are actually quite chill and down-to-earth people, and in no way advocate these violent actions. It's simply a topic they choose to write about, in the same vein as the Hollywood slasher films that are also popular. Lyric content can also vary to include other things such as politics, religion, science fiction, and more. San Francisco based Possessed and Florida's Death are both considered early pioneers of the genre. Florida ended up becoming a hotbed for death metal, and bands such as Morbid Angel, Obituary, and 6 Feet Under, among others, all got labeled as Florida death metal. Death metal quickly emerged worldwide, with bands such as Cannibal Corpse, Napalm Death, Hypocrisy, Dark Tranquillity, Amon Amarth, and many others, with several bands getting labeled as death metal along with their country of origin or spawning numerous subgenres of their own. Black metal is another form of extreme metal spawning from early thrash roots in the 80s. The genre is named after Venom's second album, Black Metal. While this album does have more in common with thrash than with later black metal acts, it has been regarded as influential enough to have the genre named after it. Black metal would come to be defined by fast tempos, similar to death metal, but rather than tuning down their instruments, most black metal bands would stay in standard tuning, creating a higher pitched droning sound with their guitars, interspersed with very thrash like riffs. Vocals will use death growls at times, but are generally sung in a very high pitched shrieking manner. And lyric content is almost exclusively satanic, focusing mostly on anti Christian and occult themes. Many bands will choose to wear face paint, commonly referred to as corpse paint. Early Bathory and Satyricon, Mayhem, Emperor, and Dark Funeral will fill this category. Although Bathory and Satyricon would both explore changes to their music style with later albums. Bands like Dimmu Borgir and Cradle of Filth will blend black metal with other metal genres. Doom metal is yet another form of extreme metal, but this time taken in a different direction. Rather than cranking up the speed, doom metal is most commonly defined by its slow tempo, along with heavily down-tuned guitars and massive, almost fuzz-like distortion. Vocals tend to favor a clean singing style, with some aggressiveness thrown in. Lyric content usually invokes a sense of doom or despair, or a feeling of helplessness at times. Lyrics that focus on drugs and drug addiction with a more laid-back vibe are prevalent in an offshoot of doom metal called stoner metal or stoner rock. The two are very similar in music style, with many bands able to fit into both descriptions. Black Sabbath is often thrown into this category, with several songs of theirs that help to lay a blueprint for doom metal. Saint Vitus, Candlemass, Cirith Ungol, and Electric Wizard are the chosen prophets of doom for this video. Former Celtic Frost member Thomas Fisher created a new band called Triptychon that is sort of a gothic black doom concoction. Sludge metal is another offshoot of doom, but I feel it deserves its own category here. Sludge metal comes from the New Orleans metal scene of the 80s, and while the term sludge implies a very thick, slow-moving substance, sludge metal tends to be a little more than just another rehash of doom. We used to refer to it as swamp metal originally, which personally I prefer using over sludge metal. New Orleans based bands were combining doom with thrash in a way that would eventually stand out on its own. Crowbar would mainly stick to their slow tempoed rhythms, fitting right in with the sludge terminology. But other bands like Graveyard Rodeo, I Hate God, Acid Bath, and Soylent Green would infuse other elements into their music, relying on both groove, hooks, and speed at times to create songs with multiple tempo changes. Vocals range from clean to very aggressive, and lyric content has almost no limits, but are typically quite dark. Musically, you can hear a range from death metal to thrash metal to doom and stoner metal, sometimes all in one song. Former Graveyard Rodeo guitarist Pepper Keenan would go on to join North Carolina's Corrosion of Conformity, bringing them into the realm of sludge metal to an extent, although personally I find they have more of a Sabbath vibe. And in the 90s, a group of sludge, or if you prefer, swamp metal musicians would form the supergroup Down, featuring members of Pantera, Crowbar, I Hate God, and Corrosion of Conformity.
Efforts, rust, and junk.
Industrial metal developed in the 80s as a fusion between metal and industrial music, as the name suggests. Heavy use of samples and keyboards, distorted vocals, and repeating guitar riffs are what define this genre. Lyrics are very often politically charged. The guitars will generally use a very similar approach to thrash, but where thrash metal will use multiple riffs and changes throughout a song, industrial metal will often only use two or three throughout an entire song. Guitar solos are typically rare in industrial metal. Prime examples of industrial metal that would define this genre best would be Ministry, KMFDM, and Fear Factory. Although, beware of early Ministry, they were not originally industrial metal when they started. Godflesh and Rammstein are more examples, and some people will throw in White Zombie to this category because of their heavy use of samples. I'm not so sure I would put them here, maybe more alternative metal or a genre we haven't quite covered yet, but enough to seem to think that they fit that I thought I'd mention it. Thanks for watching part 3. Be sure to watch part 4 for more metal subgenres.